My name is Ibrahim Traore. I was not born into power, nor into privilege, nor into a life that suggested I would one day lead a nation. I was born in 1988 in Bondoki, a small and dry town in western Burkina Faso, a place where the land teaches discipline before any teacher does, and where survival itself becomes the first lesson a child must learn. In Bondoki, honor was not a word people spoke about. It was something you proved through work, through sacrifice, through how you treated your neighbors when no one was watching. My childhood was shaped by long days, by the expectations of elders, and by a quiet belief shared by many in our community, that a man's worth is measured not by what he owns, but by what he is willing to give up for others. I did not grow up dreaming of becoming president. I dreamed of becoming useful. When I joined the army, I became an artillery officer, not because it promised glory, but because it promised purpose. For years, I served in the Sahel, a region where war has no clear front line, where enemies do not wear uniforms, and where danger does not announce itself before arriving. In that land of sand and silence, a soldier learns quickly that each sunrise is a gift, not a guarantee. I saw villages burned to the ground. I saw long lines of families fleeing with nothing but what they could carry in their hands. I saw young soldiers, many barely more than boys, forced to learn how to face death before they had truly learned how to live. War strips away illusions. It leaves only the truth of human suffering and the question of whether anything we do can truly stop it. On the 30th day of September in the year 2022, at the age of 34, I stepped into leadership not in triumph, but in desperation. Burkina Faso was drowning in crisis. For years, armed violence had spread across our land like a slow fire that no one could fully extinguish. Thousands had died. Millions had been forced from their homes. Nearly half of our territory had slipped beyond the control of the state. Schools had closed. Towns were surrounded or cut off entirely. Families lived in constant fear, never knowing whether the next day would bring hunger, displacement, or violence. A nation rich in spirit was being crushed under the weight of insecurity and uncertainty. Yet the struggle of Burkina Faso was not only military, it was also political, economic, and deeply geopolitical. Our country produces more than 70 tons of gold each year, enough to enrich any nation on earth, yet most of our people remain poor. Resources that should have been a blessing had become a point of tension, competition, and external interest. In such an environment, leadership does not bring safety. It paints a target on your back. Warnings of assassination attempts were not whispered rumors. They were expected realities. Intelligence reports, security briefings, intercepted communications all suggested that becoming the head of state also meant becoming the primary obstacle for forces both visible and invisible. I accepted that risk, not because I believed myself invincible, but because I believed the country had no time left for hesitation. But there is a difference between knowing death is possible and feeling it arrive. Only weeks after I assumed leadership, on a night that seemed ordinary at first, everything changed. What followed would push me beyond the boundary between life and death, into an experience that no military training, no political education, and no human preparation could have prepared me for. For nearly 3 hours, according to medical records, my body hovered at the edge of existence. To science, it was a critical condition. To those around me, it was a desperate fight to keep a man alive. But to me, it was not darkness. It was not emptiness. It was not nothing. The night of November 18th, 2022, began like many other nights inside the high-security compound of Kosiam Palace in Ouagadougou. The air was warm, still, almost heavy, as if the city itself were holding its breath. From the outside, the palace appeared calm, even quiet. But anyone who had lived long enough in a nation at war understands that silence is often the most dangerous sound of all. I had spent the evening reviewing reports, not ceremonial documents, not speeches, but the kind of reports that never reach the public. Intelligence updates, security assessments, accounts of attacks in distant provinces, lists of villages cut off from supplies, names of soldiers lost, names of civilians displaced, numbers that represent lives, not statistics. Leadership in a country like mine is not about comfort. It is about carrying the weight of every unanswered cry for help. At approximately 22:47, the world as I knew it shattered. A violent explosion tore through the compound, powerful enough to shake the walls and rattle the windows as though the earth itself had cracked open beneath us. The sound was not like thunder. Thunder rolls and fades. This was a sudden, brutal concussion that slammed into the body as much as the ears. For a fraction of a second, everything froze, that strange moment when the mind refuses to accept what has already happened. Then came the alarms, shouts, running footsteps, the unmistakable chaos of trained men reacting to an unthinkable breach. I remember rising from my chair, not fully aware of what I intended to do. Instinct, perhaps, or duty. A leader does not hide while others face danger, but I had taken no more than a step when a second impact struck nearby, followed by the sharp tearing sound of gunfire. Later reports would tell me that at least 3 armed assailants had penetrated the perimeter, supported by a remotely triggered explosive device placed less than 30 meters from my quarters. 30 meters, a distance so small it can be crossed in seconds, yet large enough to conceal death until the very last moment. Fragments of metal from the blast became invisible projectiles, faster than sight, faster than thought. One of those fragments tore through my left shoulder. I did not see it coming. I only felt a sudden searing impact, like being struck by a hammer made of fire. Pain arrived not as a scream but as a shock, a white flash that emptied the lungs and stole all sense of balance. My body staggered backward. Warmth spread rapidly down my side, the unmistakable sensation of blood flowing faster than the body can contain it. Voices around me became distant, as if heard underwater. Hands tried to support me. Orders were shouted, weapons discharged in rapid bursts. Somewhere, someone was praying aloud. Somewhere else, someone was screaming. But my attention drifted to something strangely ordinary. A clock. I remember seeing the digital display on a nearby device, 22:51, 4 minutes after the first explosion. It is strange what the mind chooses to hold on to when life begins to slip away. Not the attackers, not the noise, not even the pain. Just a set of glowing numbers marking a moment that would divide my life into before and after. My legs failed, the room tilted. Then gravity claimed me completely. I did not feel myself hit the ground. Medical records later indicated that my heart rate dropped below 30 beats per minute. Severe blood loss. Traumatic shock. A condition where the body begins to shut down systems one by one, prioritizing survival over consciousness until even survival becomes uncertain. Security forces neutralized the attackers. Emergency evacuation procedures were activated. I was transported under heavy protection to the military hospital at Camp Guillaume Ouedraogo. Surgeons worked against time, against blood loss, against the fragile thread that still connected me to life. But I was not aware of any of that. From my perspective, something entirely different was happening. The noise faded first, not gradually, but as if someone had turned off the sound of the world. The pain followed, dissolving into nothingness. Even the sense of having a body began to disappear. There was no fear in that moment, only a strange detachment, like watching the end of a story you had always known would conclude this way. People often imagine death as darkness, as cold, as emptiness. What I encountered first was silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, but a vast, all-encompassing stillness, a silence so complete that it felt almost alive. It did not threaten, it did not comfort, it simply existed. And then, even the sense of falling vanished. I did not know whether seconds or hours had passed. Time had lost meaning. There was no heartbeat to measure it, no breath to mark it, no movement to define it. The last thing I remember of the physical world was that glowing clock, 22:51. After that, everything changed. Because what happened next did not feel like dying. It felt like leaving. What happened next is difficult to explain using ordinary language, because ordinary language belongs to the world of bodies, of weight, of time, of distance. And what I experienced no longer belonged to that world. I became aware that I was no longer inside my body. There was no sudden realization, no dramatic moment of understanding. It was simply a quiet fact, as natural as waking from sleep. One moment there had been pain, noise, urgency. The next, there was none of that. No pressure, no gravity, no sense of flesh or bone, only awareness. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my life, not merely physically, but in a deeper sense, as if burdens I had carried for years, fear, responsibility, fatigue, sorrow had all been set down at once without my consent. The weight of leadership, the weight of war, the weight of human suffering, gone. At first there was darkness, but it was not the darkness of terror. It was not suffocating. It did not press in or threaten to swallow me. It was calm, vast, almost gentle. Imagine standing in a night so deep that it feels peaceful rather than frightening, like the sky over the desert when there are no city lights, no engines, no voices, only quiet existence. And yet, I was not alone. I could not see anyone, but I sensed presence. Not hostile, not intrusive, simply aware. It was as if the darkness itself was conscious, observing without judgment. Then I noticed movement. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that I was moving, though I could not feel motion in the physical sense. There was no wind, no change of direction, no effort. I was being drawn forward gently, steadily, as if carried by a current that required nothing from me. Behind me, somewhere far away, the world I had known seemed to recede. Below, though the word below hardly captures it, I began to perceive something familiar. Shapes, lights, patterns, the outline of a city. Ouagadougou, home to more than 2 million people, the capital of the country I had sworn to serve. But it looked different from that vantage point. The noise was gone, the dust was gone, the tension was gone. The city appeared small, fragile, almost delicate, like a map laid out on a table. Streets that once seemed crowded and chaotic were now thin lines of light. Buildings that dominated the skyline were reduced to tiny geometric forms. I remember thinking how strange it was that a place capable of holding so much suffering could look so peaceful from a distance. I saw no soldiers, no checkpoints, no fear in people's eyes, only light and shadow, a quiet world continuing its existence without me. That realization did not bring panic. It brought a deep, solemn calm. For the first time since childhood, there was nothing I could command, nothing I could change, nothing I was responsible for. The burden of decision had vanished. Whether the nation endured or fell no longer depended on my orders. Whether enemies attacked or peace arrived no longer required my response. I was simply a witness. The darkness ahead slowly began to change. At first it was subtle, like the faint hint of dawn before the sun rises, a softness, a thinning of the blackness. Then a distant glow appeared, not a point of light like a star, but a wide, gentle radiance spreading across the horizon of whatever realm I had entered. It did not hurt the eyes. In fact, it felt welcoming, almost familiar, as though I had always known it was there, even if I had never seen it before. As I moved closer, the light grew brighter but never harsh. It was not the sterile brightness of hospital lamps or the blinding flash of explosions. It was warm, living light, the kind that seems to carry peace within it. And with that light came something else. A feeling. Not an emotion exactly, but a presence of profound peace. Deeper than anything I'd ever experienced on earth. The kind of peace that does not depend on circumstances, that cannot be shaken by danger or loss. It was complete, absolute, beyond argument or doubt. The pain in my shoulder was gone. The memory of violence felt distant, irrelevant. Even the memories of war, of burned villages and frightened children, seemed softened, as if the sharp edges had been removed. I did not feel joy in the ordinary sense. I felt something greater, a sense of being understood completely, accepted completely, known completely without needing to explain anything. For a man who had spent years in environments where trust was rare and vigilance constant, that sensation was overwhelming. I realized then that I was not merely approaching light, I was approaching someone. A figure began to take shape within the radiance, not emerging from it but existing as part of it. A human form, standing calmly, clothed in white that seemed less like fabric and more like light, made solid. There was no dramatic movement, no gesture meant to startle or impress, only stillness. Yet that stillness carried immense authority. I did not recognize him through physical features alone. It was not a matter of comparing faces to paintings or statues. Recognition came from somewhere deeper, from a place beyond sight. Peace intensified. A sense of absolute safety settled over me, the kind of safety a child feels in the presence of a loving parent, multiplied beyond measure. At the same time, there was profound reverence, the awareness that I stood before a power greater than anything in the universe. Without being told, without needing confirmation, I knew who he was. Jesus. Not as an image shaped by art or tradition, but as a living presence. Not distant, not symbolic, not abstract, real, immediate, undeniable. The feeling of love that radiated from him was not sentimental or weak. It was strong, steady, unshakable, like the foundation of existence itself. He did not approach me. He did not need to. Distance had ceased to matter. Time had ceased to matter. Everything that defined human experience seemed to have fallen away, leaving only the encounter itself. And in that moment, standing in a place beyond the reach of war, politics, or death, I understood something with absolute clarity. My life on earth had not been an accident. My survival had not been random. And whatever was about to happen next would determine whether I returned or continued forward into a reality from which no one comes back. I waited. Not with fear, not with impatience, but with the quiet awareness that my fate and perhaps the fate of my nation was about to be spoken aloud. When he spoke, there was no movement of lips that I could clearly see, no sound traveling through air as it does in the physical world. Yet the words reached me with absolute clarity, not only heard, but understood at the deepest level of my being, as if they were spoken directly into my soul rather than into my ears. Ibrahim. My name did not sound like a label. It sounded like recognition, like someone calling a child they have known since before that child was born. Your mission is not finished. There was no accusation in his voice, no urgency, no disappointment, only certainty. In that moment, everything I had done in my life, Every decision, every battle, every sacrifice seemed small compared to the weight of those simple words. Not finished, which meant it had begun for a reason, which meant it mattered. I did not ask whether I was dead. I already knew I had crossed beyond the boundary of ordinary life. Instead, the first thought that rose within me was not about myself at all. It was about my country. Burkina Faso, I said, or perhaps I thought, because speech no longer required breath. What will happen to my people? Images unfolded immediately, not like a sequence of photographs, but like living reality revealed all at once. I saw the land I had sworn to protect, not from a distance, but from many places at the same time, as if I were present everywhere. I saw Djibo, a town that had endured siege and isolation, where families lived under constant threat, where supplies were scarce and fear was as common as dust. I saw Kaya, crowded with displaced people who had fled violence in the north, carrying their children, their elders, their memories of homes they might never see again. I saw Dori, where young men stood guard through the night, knowing that dawn might bring attack. Villages appeared, some intact, some reduced to blackened remains. Roofs burned away, walls collapsed, cooking pots scattered in the sand as if abandoned mid-meal. Places where laughter had once filled the air, now silent except for wind. I saw columns of people walking along dry roads stretching for kilometers. Mothers carrying infants. Children clutching small bundles that contained everything they owned. Elderly men leaning on sticks, refusing to fall behind even when exhaustion bent their backs. More than 2 million displaced souls, each one a story, a family, a loss. Then I saw soldiers. Not the polished image of soldiers in parades, but the reality of young men in worn uniforms, their faces lined with fatigue beyond their years. Many were barely 18 or 20. Some had not yet finished growing into adulthood, yet they carried rifles and responsibilities heavier than most people would bear in a lifetime. They stood in defensive positions, watching horizons that revealed nothing yet could hide everything. They slept lightly, ready to wake at the slightest sound. They wrote messages to families they might never see again. Some prayed quietly before nightfall. Others stared into the distance, lost in thoughts they would never share. I recognized in them the same determination I had once felt as a young officer, the stubborn refusal to abandon the land that had shaped us, even when that land seemed to offer only hardship in return. The scenes did not end with suffering. I also saw courage. Villagers rebuilding homes with whatever materials they could find. Teachers gathering children under trees to continue lessons even when schools had been destroyed. Women organizing food distribution for families who had nothing left. Religious leaders praying openly despite danger, offering hope where there was almost none. Human resilience shining through devastation. Why must they suffer like this? I asked. The question was not political. It was not strategic. It was human. Jesus did not immediately answer with explanations or arguments. Instead, he allowed me to see more deeply not only the present but the forces shaping it. Layers of conflict that extended beyond simple headlines or military reports. Terror groups moving across borders. Smuggling networks, hidden alliances, interests that viewed the region not as home to millions of people, but as territory to be influenced, controlled, or exploited. War without clear front lines, enemies without uniforms, motivations that shifted like sand in the wind. Burkina Faso was not merely fighting terrorists. It was caught in a web of instability that stretched across the Sahel and beyond, touching economic ambitions, political rivalries, and resources buried beneath the earth. And yet, amid all those forces, ordinary people continued to wake each morning, plant crops when they could, send children to learn when it was safe, pray for peace when nothing else remained. I cannot protect them all, I said, the admission heavier than any command I had ever given. No human leader can, he replied gently. There was no condemnation in that statement. Only truth. A leader can deploy soldiers, a leader can sign decrees, a leader can negotiate alliances or reject them, but no leader can personally shield millions from every bullet, every explosion, every act of cruelty. The realization did not weaken me. It clarified something I had long carried but rarely voiced, that leadership is not the power to control everything, but the responsibility to stand in the storm with your people. I saw then the faces of children. Some were smiling despite their circumstances. Others looked older than their years, eyes shaped by experiences no child should endure. Yet even in the hardest places, children played when they could, laughed when they forgot their fears, dreamed of futures not yet stolen from them. They are the future, I said. Yes, he answered, and the future is not decided only by those who fight, but by those who endure. The images began to slow, then fade, not disappearing entirely, but receding like memories placed gently back into the heart. The suffering, the courage, the uncertainty, all of it remained part of reality, yet I understood that I had been shown these things for a reason. not to overwhelm me, not to paralyze me, but to remind me what leadership truly meant. Not territory, not power, people. When I looked again at Jesus, the light around him had not changed, but my understanding had. I was no longer seeing him as a distant divine figure. I was seeing him as someone who understood suffering more deeply than any human ever could. Someone who had walked among the poor, the persecuted, the forgotten. And I sensed that what he was about to show me next would reach beyond the present moment, beyond the current war, beyond even my lifetime. Because if my mission was not finished, then the future itself was part of that mission. After the visions of suffering faded, a deeper stillness settled around us. It was not empty. It felt like the pause between heartbeats, the moment when something unseen gathers strength before revealing itself. Ibrahim, Jesus said, and his voice carried both gravity and compassion, what your nation faces is not only the violence you can see. At once, the darkness beyond the light shifted again, and new images unfolded not of the present, but of years yet to come. I saw Burkina Faso from above, not as a battlefield, but as a point on a vast map of West Africa. Borders that humans had drawn appeared thin and fragile, almost meaningless compared to the forces moving across them. Lines on paper could not contain ideology, ambition, or desperation. Then the earth itself seemed to open. Beneath the soil of my country, I saw veins of gold, not metaphorical, but real, gleaming deposits stretching through the land like hidden rivers of light. Burkina Faso produces more than 70 tons of gold each year, yet most of our people live with scarcity. From that vantage point, the contradiction was painfully clear. Immense wealth beneath the ground, immense hardship above it. The gold did not belong to any one person, yet many desired control over it. I saw foreign interests watching, calculating, measuring risks and opportunities. Not necessarily armies marching in formation, but influence operating through quieter means, economic pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, alliances that promised assistance while expecting loyalty in return. Burkina Faso was not only fighting terrorism, it was navigating a struggle over resources, sovereignty, and independence in a world where powerful nations rarely ignore strategic value. Then the images shifted again. I saw years of difficulty ahead, not one crisis, but many, layered upon each other like waves that refused to stop crashing against the shore. Sanctions, isolation, economic hardship, supplies delayed or restricted, currency pressures that made ordinary goods more expensive for ordinary families, international criticism from voices that did not always understand the realities on the ground. I saw leaders from other nations speaking about Burkina Faso as if it were an abstract problem rather than a home to millions of human beings. Decisions made in distant rooms sending consequences across deserts and villages where those decision makers would never set foot. Then came a darker vision. I saw instability within the country itself. Whispers of dissent, factions forming, the ever-present risk of another coup. In a nation already strained by conflict, even small divisions can widen into dangerous fractures. Leadership, I realized, would not only be tested by external pressure but by internal uncertainty. The weight of it pressed on me even in that bodiless state. Will we survive this? I asked. The question was not about my position. It was about the nation itself. Jesus looked at me, and in his gaze there was neither alarm nor indifference, only calm assurance. Burkina Faso will not be erased. The words did not sound like a prediction. They sounded like a promise. Immediately the images changed. Where I had seen hardship, I now saw possibility. Not an easy future, not a sudden transformation, but gradual rebuilding. Roads stretching across regions that had long been isolated, schools reopening where silence had replaced children's voices, teachers returning, markets filling again with traders and farmers exchanging goods instead of fear. I saw children walking to class carrying books instead of fleeing with bundles of belongings. I saw communities rebuilding homes not as temporary shelters, but as places meant to last. The contrast was so powerful it almost felt unreal. What determines which future comes to pass? I asked. He did not answer with military strategies or political formulas. Instead, he spoke about leadership. A leader is not given authority to stand above his people, he said, but to carry their pain. The statement struck deeper than any criticism or praise ever could. In politics, leaders are often portrayed as powerful figures commanding events from above. Yet here was a definition that reversed everything. Leadership is burden, not privilege. If you forget the poor, he continued, you will lose the soul of your nation. I saw then another kind of danger, quieter than war, yet just as destructive. The temptation to govern for stability alone, for international approval, for economic indicators, while overlooking those who suffer most. A nation can appear strong on paper while its people feel abandoned in reality. He showed me Burkina Faso standing alone on the map of West Africa, isolated politically, misunderstood by many. But behind that solitary outline were millions of citizens, farmers, teachers, soldiers, mothers, elders, praying, hoping, enduring. You may be abandoned by the world, he said, but do not abandon your people. Those words carried a warning as much as encouragement. External alliances can shift, support can fade, praise can turn into criticism overnight, but the bond between a leader and his people must not depend on approval from outside forces. I understood then that the greatest threat was not isolation itself, but the loss of purpose that isolation can produce. A leader who governs only to survive politically may forget why he accepted responsibility in the first place. Another vision appeared. I saw infrastructure projects, modest at first, then expanding. Agricultural development, reducing dependence on uncertain imports. Local industries growing slowly, imperfectly, but steadily. Not the dramatic prosperity often promised in speeches, but the kind of progress that changes daily life for ordinary families. Hope not as a slogan, but as a visible reality. Yet even these positive scenes were not free from struggle. Setbacks occurred, attacks continued in some regions, political tension did not disappear. The future was not portrayed as a miracle solution, but as a long road requiring endurance. Why show me both suffering and hope, I asked. Because truth contains both, he replied. A nation's destiny is not shaped by one event or one decision, but by countless choices made over time by leaders, by citizens, by forces both visible and hidden. The vision slowly faded, leaving only the light and his presence. I felt neither despair nor triumph, but a sober understanding. If I returned to life, I would not return to comfort. I would return to a path filled with difficulty, misunderstanding, and sacrifice. Yet, I would also return with the knowledge that the future was not predetermined by fear alone. Burkina Faso's story was still being written, and I was expected to play my part in it, not as a ruler seeking glory, but as a servant carrying responsibility. I sensed then that what he would say next would move beyond national survival into something even more personal, the inner condition required of any leader entrusted with such a burden. After the visions of my country's future faded, I remained suspended in that radiant stillness, aware that what I had seen was not merely information but responsibility. The images had shown struggle and hope, danger and endurance, but they had not yet addressed the most difficult question of all. How does a man carry such a burden without being crushed by it? Jesus looked at me with a depth of understanding that made it impossible to hide anything, not fear, not doubt, not even the quiet exhaustion I had long concealed from others. In his presence, pretense had no meaning, titles had no meaning, only truth remained. You will face times, he said, when your nation stands alone. The words did not sound like speculation, they sounded like certainty. I saw again the outline of Burkina Faso on the map, not surrounded by enemies, but separated diplomatically, economically, politically, partnerships strained, agreements questioned, support withdrawn or conditioned upon compromises that would demand more than they offered. Isolation is a peculiar form of pressure. It does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives as silence, as closed doors, as invitations that never come, as negotiations that stall without explanation. It forces a nation to stand on its own strength, whether it is ready or not. You may be misunderstood, he continued. You may be criticized by those who do not see what your people endure. You may even be punished for decisions made in defense of your nation. I thought of economic sanctions, of restricted trade, of frozen aid, of headlines written far away by people who would never witness the conditions on the ground. For a developing country already strained by conflict, such measures can deepen hardship for ordinary citizens more than for leaders. Then how can I protect them, I asked. The question was not about political survival, about human survival, food, medicine, stability, dignity. He did not answer with tactics. Instead, he spoke about something far more fundamental. A leader is not chosen to stand above his people, he said, but to kneel before God on their behalf. The image was powerful, not a ruler seated on a throne, but a man on his knees, carrying the weight of millions in prayer rather than in pride. No nation can be guided rightly, he continued, by a leader who worships power more than truth. I understood then that the danger was not only external pressure, it was internal transformation, the slow, almost invisible shift that can occur when authority becomes identity, when decisions are driven by ego rather than conscience. Power can persuade a man that he is indispensable. Faith reminds him that he is accountable. If you forget the poor, he said again, more firmly this time, you will lose the soul of your country. I saw scenes not of war but of inequality, remote communities neglected because they lacked political influence, families overlooked because they had no voice in national debates, individuals suffering quietly while attention focused elsewhere. A nation can survive conflict and still decay from within if compassion disappears from governance. Your people are not statistics, he said. They are lives entrusted to your care. Another realization struck me then. Leadership often demands decisions that cannot satisfy everyone. Resources are limited, threats are many. Choices involve trade-offs that inevitably leave some disappointed. Yet there is a difference between making difficult decisions and becoming indifferent to those affected by them. He showed me a future moment when I would be tempted to focus only on stability, security, and international standing, measurable achievements that could be defended publicly while ignoring suffering that was less visible but no less real. That is when you must remember why you were called, he said. Not called to rule, called to serve. Then came a warning that cut deeper than any threat of violence. You may be praised one day and condemned the next. Do not build your identity on either. Public opinion is unstable. Applause can turn into criticism without warning. A leader who depends on approval becomes vulnerable to manipulation, constantly adjusting direction to maintain popularity rather than pursuing what is right. Seek first what is just, he said, not what is easy. I felt then how lonely that path could be. Justice does not always produce immediate reward. Sometimes it produces resistance, misunderstanding, even hostility. But what if I fail? I asked quietly. The question came from a place I rarely allowed others to see, not fear of losing position, but fear of not being strong enough to fulfill what was required. Failure is not refusing to succeed, he said. Failure is refusing to stand again after falling. There was mercy in those words, not permission to abandon responsibility, but acknowledgement that human beings are imperfect. Leadership does not require flawless performance. It requires perseverance guided by conscience. Then his expression softened even further. Do not abandon your people, he said, even if the world abandons you. I saw again the map of Burkina Faso standing alone, but this time I also saw faces behind it, millions of citizens looking not outward for salvation, but inward toward their own resilience. A nation's greatest strength is not alliances or resources alone. It is the bond between its people and those who lead them. If that bond breaks, no external support can replace it. If that bond holds, even isolation can be endured. Another vision appeared, quieter but deeply moving. I saw citizens praying in churches and mosques and homes under open skies, asking for peace, for protection, for guidance. Different faiths, different languages, different traditions, yet united by the same longing for stability and dignity. Hope expressed not through speeches but through faith. They are not alone, he said, and neither are you. For the first time since the visions began, I felt something like strength returning, not physical strength, but moral clarity. The path ahead would not be easy. It would demand sacrifices I could not yet foresee. It would likely involve moments of doubt, criticism, and exhaustion. But it would also have purpose. And purpose can sustain a man long after comfort has disappeared. The light around us grew subtly brighter, as if signaling that this part of the encounter was drawing to a close. I sensed that what remained to be said would not concern national policy or external challenges, but something even more fundamental, the inner posture required of any leader who hopes to guide others without losing his own soul. The light did not intensify suddenly. It deepened, becoming fuller, richer, as though it carried meaning as well as radiance. I sensed that what was about to be revealed would not concern events or strategies, but something more enduring, the foundation upon which every decision, every action, every legacy must stand. Jesus regarded me not as a ruler, not as a soldier, not even as the representative of a nation, but simply as a man. A human being with limits, fears, and the capacity both to build and to destroy. If you truly wish to save your people, he said, you must first learn to kneel. The statement did not refer to defeat. It referred to humility, a posture that modern leadership often avoids because it appears weak. Yet in that moment I understood that kneeling before God is not surrender to powerlessness. It is surrender to truth. No one can guide a nation, he continued, while trying to sit on the throne of pride. I saw then how pride operates in subtle ways. It does not always appear as arrogance or cruelty. Sometimes it disguises itself as certainty, as the belief that one's own judgment is sufficient, that consultation is unnecessary, that accountability is optional. Pride isolates a leader from correction, from wisdom, from compassion. An isolation of the heart is far more dangerous than political isolation. Human authority, he said, is temporary. Images passed before me, rulers of the past, empires that once seemed unshakable, governments that believed themselves permanent, yet eventually faded into history, palaces crumble, armies disperse, names once spoken with reverence become footnotes in books. No human power endures forever. Armies can defend borders, he said, laws can maintain order, wealth can build cities, but only wisdom from God can keep a people from losing their soul. That distinction struck me deeply. A country can be secure yet corrupt, prosperous yet unjust, organized yet spiritually empty. True stability requires more than material strength, it requires moral direction. He showed me a leader surrounded by advisors, technology, and information, yet unable to make righteous decisions because he listened only to ambition. Then he showed another leader walking through hardship, misunderstood and even criticized, yet guided by conscience and faith. The difference was not resources. It was orientation, whether the heart faced upward toward truth or inward toward self-interest. Do not trust entirely in weapons, he said. Do not trust entirely in applause. Do not trust entirely in your own plans. Each of those sources of confidence can collapse without warning. Weapons can fail. Public support can vanish. Strategies can prove flawed. A leader who depends exclusively on any of these builds on unstable ground. Seek guidance before action, he continued. Pray before deciding, be humble before commanding. Fear wounding God's justice more than losing human approval. Those words redefine courage. True courage is not merely facing enemies, it is facing one's own conscience, acknowledging uncertainty, admitting the need for wisdom beyond personal intelligence. I realized then how often leaders are pressured to appear infallible, decisive, unwavering, yet such appearances can conceal dangerous blindness. The willingness to seek divine guidance is not weakness, it is protection against self-destruction. If a leader listens only to ambition, he said, he may conquer a throne, but lose his people. History is filled with such examples, rulers who achieved dominance yet left behind suffering, resentment, or ruin. But if a leader listens to God, he continued, he may walk through loneliness, misunderstanding, even pain, yet he will not walk the wrong path. Loneliness is rarely discussed as a leadership challenge, yet it is real. Decisions that affect millions cannot always be explained fully. Sacrifices required for long-term stability may be unpopular in the short term. A leader guided by conscience may stand apart even from allies. Still, the alternative, abandoning moral direction for comfort, leads to consequences far more destructive. Another realization unfolded within me. Faith is not merely a private belief system for a leader. It is the compass that determines how power is used. Without it, authority can drift toward oppression, favoritism, or indifference. To place God above all, he said, is not to speak of faith with your lips, but to let him shape every thought, every decision, every goal. This meant governing with conscience rather than convenience. Evaluating policies not only by economic benefit or political advantage, but by their impact on the vulnerable, the poor, the weak, the forgotten. Before asking, what strengthens my authority, a leader must ask, what brings life to my people? Because a nation does not collapse only from bombs or invasion, it can collapse when its leadership loses reverence for justice, compassion, and truth. He then addressed the temptation that has destroyed many rulers across history. Do not see yourself as a savior. The statement pierced through any illusion of heroic identity. Leaders are often portrayed as figures who rescue nations, yet such narratives can inflate ego and distort responsibility. You are not the source of salvation, he said. You are an instrument for a time. An instrument, not the composer, not the purpose, but a tool through which something greater may act. When leaders forget this, power becomes idolatry. When they remember it, power becomes service. I understood then that I had not been called to be admired, but to bear weight. Not to secure comfort for myself, but to remain faithful to a mission entrusted to me for a limited season. And that mission would likely involve difficulty, sacrifice, and uncertainty. Yet it would also have meaning. The future of a nation, he said, is not seen by human eyes alone. God sees what lies beyond the horizon. Therefore, decisions based solely on immediate advantage can overlook consequences that unfold years later. Divine guidance considers not only present stability but long-term destiny. Finally, he gave what felt like a concluding foundation for everything I would do if I returned to life. Place God first, let him lead. Ask for light before every decision. Humans see the present benefit, God sees the fate of generations. The words settled into me not as instruction to be memorized, but as truth engraved into the core of my being. If Burkina Faso was to emerge from darkness, I could not attempt to walk ahead of God, relying solely on strategy or strength. I would have to follow, even when the path was unclear, even when it was lonely. even when it required sacrifices that others might never fully understand. As the final echoes of his teaching faded, I sensed a shift not in his presence, which remained constant, but in my own state. Something was changing, as if the encounter was approaching its conclusion. And then, without warning, the peace that had surrounded me began to give way to something I had not felt since the explosion. Pain. The pain did not arrive gradually. It struck like a storm, breaking through a clear sky, sudden, overwhelming, undeniable. One moment I was suspended in perfect peace, untouched by suffering, and the next I was dragged back into a reality defined by flesh, nerves, and gravity. It felt as if something seized me and pulled me downward at tremendous speed. Not falling through air, but through layers of existence. The light receded, the stillness shattered, awareness condensed, compressed, forced back into limits it had briefly escaped. Then came sensation, burning, pressure, weight. The wound in my shoulder blazed with such intensity that it seemed to consume my entire body. Muscles tightened involuntarily. My chest felt heavy, as if a massive stone had been placed upon it. Every breath required effort, as though my lungs had forgotten how to function and needed to relearn the simplest act of survival. Sound returned next, but not as coherent voices. At first it was only noise, indistinct, chaotic, overwhelming, beeping tones, metallic clatter, urgent murmurs, the rustle of fabric. Footsteps moving quickly across hard floors. I wanted to escape back into the silence I had just left, but there was no path backward. Cold touched my skin. Not the gentle coolness of night air, but the clinical chill of a hospital environment. Something pressed against my face, an oxygen mask, though I did not yet understand it. Tubes tugged at my arms. My body felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else, and I had been forced to inhabit it without preparation. Then came the most shocking sensation of all. Breath. Air filled my lungs in a sharp, involuntary gasp, followed by another and another, each one accompanied by pain that radiated through my chest. Breathing. Something so effortless in life felt like labor, yet it also carried a strange reassurance. I was alive, or at least I was no longer gone. My eyelids were heavy, as though they had been sealed shut. Opening them required more strength than I believed I possessed. But slowly, painfully, light forced its way in. The ceiling above me was unfamiliar, white, sterile, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lamps. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision, blurred figures leaning over me, their outlines distorted by tears I did not realize were forming. Voices began to separate from the noise. He's responding. Stay with us. Pulse is improving. The words sounded distant, as if spoken from the far end of a long corridor. I could not yet form a reply. My tongue felt thick, uncooperative. Even swallowing required effort. Hands touched my arms, my forehead, my chest, checking, stabilizing, reassuring. I sensed urgency, but also relief. People who had prepared themselves for loss were now witnessing something unexpected. Later, I would learn that I was in the military hospital at Camp Guillermo Ouedraogo in Ouagadougou. Surgeons had worked to stop the bleeding, to repair damage, to sustain vital functions that had nearly failed. For close to 3 hours, my condition had been critical, a period during which survival was uncertain, even with the best medical intervention available. 3 hours. To the world outside, it had been a desperate medical struggle. To me, it had been an encounter beyond life itself. I tried to speak, but only a faint sound emerged, barely audible even to my own ears. A nurse leaned closer, her expression a mixture of concentration and disbelief, as if she feared the moment might reverse if she moved too quickly. You're safe, she said softly. Safe. The word felt strange. Safety had not been part of my reality for a long time, even before the attack. Yet, lying there, surrounded by equipment and personnel, I realized that safety no longer meant control or protection from danger. It meant simply being present in the world again. Pain surged as I attempted to move my shoulder, reminding me instantly of the wound that had brought me to the brink of death. My body protested every motion. Muscles trembled with weakness. Even lifting a hand felt like a monumental effort. But beneath the physical suffering was something else. Memory. Not fading fragments, not dreamlike impressions, but clear recollection of everything I had experienced. The darkness, the light, the presence of Jesus, the visions of my country, the words spoken to me. None of it felt imaginary. None of it felt symbolic. It felt more real than the hospital room itself. I knew then, with a certainty beyond argument, that my return was not random. Someone had allowed me to come back. Doctors continued their work, adjusting monitors, administering medication, checking responses. Their professionalism masked what I would later understand to be astonishment. A patient whose vital signs had declined so severely for so long was now conscious. A miracle, some would say. An improbable recovery, others might argue. But lying there, barely able to move, I did not concern myself with explanations. I was not thinking about statistics or medical terminology. I was thinking about responsibility. Because survival carries a question. Why this life preserved when so many others had been lost? Why this opportunity restored when it could easily have ended? Why return to a world of conflict, pressure, and danger after experiencing peace beyond description? The answer was already within me, echoing from the encounter I had just left. Your mission is not finished. Tears slipped from the corners of my eyes, not from physical pain alone, but from the overwhelming awareness that I had been given something both precious and heavy: time. Time to act. Time to lead. Time to fulfill what had been entrusted to me. One of the doctors noticed the tears and assumed they were a sign of distress. He spoke reassuringly, explaining that I was stable, that I was under care, that I would recover. His words were kind, but they addressed only the surface of what I was feeling. I was not afraid. I was humbled, because I understood that I had crossed a boundary few people approach and returned, not by my own strength, not by strategy, not by authority, but by grace. Breathing still hurt, movement still hurt. Every sensation reminded me of how fragile the human body truly is. Yet beneath the fragility was a renewed determination, quiet, steady, unshakable. If I had been spared, it was not to retreat into safety. It was to continue. And continue I would, though I knew the path ahead would demand more than anything I had faced before. The days following my awakening passed in a haze of medication, medical examinations, and guarded conversations. My body was weak, drained not only by blood loss but by the shock of trauma. Even sitting upright required assistance. Walking was impossible at first. Sleep came in short, fractured intervals, interrupted by pain or the constant monitoring of machines. Yet my mind was clear in a way it had never been before. People came to see me, doctors, military officers, security personnel, clothes aides. Their faces showed relief, but also caution, as if they feared speaking too loudly might disturb a fragile recovery. They spoke about physical progress, about stability, about timelines for rehabilitation. No one spoke about the deeper question: what happens now? In the quiet moments, when the room was still and only the rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the air, I replayed the experience again and again, not out of disbelief, but out of reverence. Each word spoken to me, each vision shown, carried weight far beyond personal comfort. I had not been returned to life simply to survive. I had been returned to continue. That realization settled into me slowly, like a stone placed carefully into the center of a river. It did not create panic. It created resolve. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the hospital window, I watched dust particles drifting in the air, illuminated by the beam of light. It struck me how ordinary the scene was, something I might never have noticed before. Yet after what I had experienced, even such simple details felt meaningful. Life itself had become precious in a way that no speech or philosophy could have taught me. A senior officer entered the room quietly. He saluted, not out of ceremony but out of genuine respect. His expression carried both relief and expectation, as if he needed reassurance that the man he had followed was still present. "Sir," he said gently, "the country is waiting." The words were not a demand, they were a reality. Leadership in a time of crisis does not pause because the leader is wounded. Decisions continue to be required, threats continue to evolve, citizens continue to hope for stability. I looked at him for a long moment before responding. My voice was weak, rough from disuse, but steady. "How are the people? Not the military situation, not political alliances, not security protocols. The people." He seemed almost surprised by the question, then answered carefully, describing displacement numbers, supply challenges, areas where violence had intensified, areas where relative calm had returned. Statistics again, necessary, yet insufficient to capture the human dimension behind them. As he spoke, I saw not numbers but faces from the visions I had been shown. Mothers carrying children, young soldiers on watch, teachers gathering students under trees. The connection between those images and the reports in front of me felt immediate, undeniable. I realized then that my experience had not removed me from reality, it had anchored me more deeply in it. When the officer finished, he hesitated, then asked quietly, "Do you feel strong enough to resume your duties?" The question contained more than concern for my health. It carried the unspoken anxiety of a nation uncertain about its future. I closed my eyes briefly, not from fatigue but to listen inwardly. Fear was present. Yes, fear of physical vulnerability, fear of failing those who depended on me, fear of the unknown challenges ahead. But beneath that fear was something stronger. Purpose. I will return, I said. Not dramatically, not heroically, simply as a statement of fact. Because the alternative, withdrawing into safety while others faced danger, no longer felt like an option. After standing in a place beyond life and being sent back, retreat would have been a betrayal of everything I had been shown. In the following days, plans were made for my gradual reintegration into leadership. Meetings were shortened, briefings were delivered in stages. Medical personnel remained close, ready to intervene if my condition deteriorated. But something had changed in how I approached those responsibilities. Before the attack, leadership often felt like a constant race against time, responding to crises, making decisions under pressure, moving from one urgent matter to the next. Now, there was a quieter center within me, a place of stillness that remained even amid tension. I listened more carefully. I spoke more deliberately. I weighed not only strategic outcomes but human consequences. It was not that I had become less decisive. If anything, clarity made decisions easier. When priorities are aligned with purpose, hesitation decreases. The challenge is no longer choosing between many competing interests, but remaining faithful to what truly matters. One evening, alone in the hospital room, I whispered a prayer, not a formal one, not something memorized, just simple words of gratitude and requests for guidance. It felt natural, necessary, like breathing. I realized then that the encounter had not only shown me the future, it had changed how I would walk into that future. Leadership was no longer about maintaining authority. It was about stewardship, caring for something that did not belong to me but had been entrusted to me. I thought of the phrase spoken to me. A leader is not given power to stand above his people, but to carry their pain. Pain cannot be carried from a distance. It requires presence. Gradually, strength returned to my body. The wound healed, though it left scars, reminders etched into flesh of how close death had come. Physical therapy restored movement. Breathing became easier. The oxygen mask disappeared. The machines were removed one by one until the room resembled an ordinary hospital space rather than an intensive care unit. Each small improvement felt like a step back into the world. But I did not step back as the same man who had left it. I stepped back knowing that survival had meaning, knowing that Burkina Faso's story was still unfolding, knowing that my role in that story had not yet reached its conclusion, and perhaps most importantly, knowing that leadership grounded in humility and faith could endure pressures that power alone could not withstand. When the day finally came for me to leave the hospital, I paused before crossing the threshold, taking a final look at the room where life had been restored to me. Gratitude filled me, not only for the medical team, not only for the protection that had preserved me, but for the opportunity itself. Many do not receive a second chance. I had, and I intended to use it. Recovery gave me time to reflect in ways that leadership rarely allows. When the body is forced to slow down, the mind often travels farther than it ever did during activity. Lying awake at night, listening to the quiet sounds of a city that never fully sleeps, I found myself revisiting not only the experience itself, but what it meant for the life I had been given back. Surviving an assassination attempt changes a man. Standing at the threshold between life and death changes him even more. But encountering something beyond death, something filled with truth, peace, and unmistakable authority changes him in ways that cannot be reversed. The first lesson was about fragility. Before that night, I understood intellectually that life is uncertain. As a soldier, I had seen death often enough to know that survival is never guaranteed. Yet there is a difference between observing mortality and experiencing your own. Power does not protect the human body. Rank does not slow a bullet. Authority does not stop blood from flowing when flesh is torn. In a single instant, all external identities fall away, leaving only a vulnerable human being. I realized how easily everything we build can disappear. Reputation, position, plans for the future. None of it travels with us beyond the boundary of life. What remains is not what we possessed, but who we were. The second lesson was about responsibility. Being spared is not a reward, it is a task. Many good men and women had died in the conflict that surrounded my nation, soldiers who stood their ground, civilians caught in violence they never chose, children whose futures ended before they began. Why should I survive when so many others did not? The only answer that made sense was purpose. If my life had been preserved, it was not because I was more worthy, it was because something remained for me to do. That understanding removed any temptation to see survival as personal fortune. Instead, it felt like receiving a burden wrapped in grace. The third lesson was about fear. Fear had been a constant companion in the Sahel, though rarely acknowledged openly. Fear of ambush, fear of betrayal, fear of failure, fear of losing those under your command. Leadership adds another layer, fear of making decisions that will affect millions of lives. Yet during the experience beyond my body, fear had vanished completely. Not suppressed, not overcome through effort, but simply absent. In the presence of divine peace, fear had no place to exist. Returning to the world meant fear would inevitably return as well. But now I knew something I had not known before. Fear is not ultimate. It does not define reality. It is a condition of human limitation, not a permanent state. Courage, I realized, is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear determine action. The fourth lesson concerned time. We treat time as abundant, even when we claim to know it is short. We postpone difficult conversations, acts of kindness, spiritual reflection, assuming there will be another opportunity later. Nearly dying removes that illusion. Time is not owned, it is granted. Every hour becomes meaningful when you understand how easily it can be taken away. Small moments, a conversation, a sunrise, the sound of children laughing outside a window acquire significance because they are no longer taken for granted. I began to measure days not by productivity alone, but by whether they were used for something worthwhile. The fifth lesson was about humility. Standing before Jesus, I had not felt like a president or a commander. I had felt like a child, known completely, understood completely, stripped of every mask. There was no space for pride in that encounter. Back in the world, people still addressed me with titles, still saluted, still deferred, yet inwardly those external signs of authority felt less important. Respect is necessary for order, but pride is poison to judgment. Humility does not mean weakness. It means remembering the source of one's limitations as well as one's responsibilities. The sixth lesson involved faith itself. Faith had always been part of my life, shaped by culture, upbringing, and personal conviction. But faith, after such an experience, was no longer theoretical. It was not based on tradition or reasoning alone. It was anchored in encounter. I did not need to convince myself that God exists. I needed only to remember what I had seen and heard. That did not mean doubt would never arise. Human beings question, struggle, wrestle with uncertainty. But beneath those fluctuations lay a foundation that could not be shaken. Faith became less about words spoken publicly and more about orientation, the direction of the heart when no one else is watching. The seventh lesson was about compassion. Seeing the suffering of my people from that vantage point had stripped away any abstraction. It is easy, in positions of authority, to discuss crises in terms of policy, security metrics, or economic indicators. Necessary as those tools are, they can create distance from human reality. After the experience, every report felt personal. Every statistic represented lives, families, futures. Decisions were no longer about managing situations, but about alleviating suffering where possible. Compassion, I realized, is not optional for leadership. Without it, governance becomes mechanical, detached, and ultimately unjust. Finally, there was a lesson about hope. Hope is often misunderstood as optimism, the expectation that things will improve. But true hope persists even when improvement is uncertain. It is not based on favorable circumstances, but on trust that meaning exists beyond those circumstances. Standing at the edge of eternity, I had seen that human history is not random chaos. There is direction, purpose, accountability beyond immediate events. That knowledge made it possible to face difficulties without surrendering to despair. Hope then became not a feeling but a decision, the decision to act as though the future matters because it does. These lessons did not arrive as commandments written on stone. They emerged gradually like dawn spreading across the horizon. Some days I understood them clearly. Other days I struggled, distracted by the pressures of leadership and the complexities of reality. But they remained within me, shaping how I saw the world, how I approached decisions, how I interacted with those around me. Near-death experiences are often described as life-changing. That phrase is accurate but incomplete. It is not merely that life feels different afterward. It is that life is revealed as something far more sacred, fragile, and purposeful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. And if those lessons were meant only for me, they would have been enough. But I sensed they were not meant to remain private. Because what I had experienced carried meaning not just for a leader, not just for a nation, but for anyone who wonders whether suffering has purpose, whether faith matters, whether hope is justified. As my strength returned and my duties resumed, I became increasingly aware that the experience I had been given was not meant to remain locked inside my own memory. Some encounters are personal, meant only to comfort or guide an individual. But others carry a message that extends beyond one life, one office, one nation. What I had witnessed belonged to that second category. I began to reflect not as a president, not as a soldier, but simply as a man who had stood at the boundary of existence and returned. What could such an experience offer to those who would never wear a uniform, never sit in a government office, never command armies or sign decrees? The answer I realized was everything. Because in the presence of eternity, distinctions of status disappear, wealth, nationality, education, profession, none of these determine the value of a soul. The child in a remote village and the leader of a nation stand on equal ground before God. The first message is simple, yet difficult for many to accept. God sees you. Not as part of a crowd, not as a number among billions, but as an individual life known completely. In the encounter I experienced, nothing about me was hidden. Not my strengths, not my failures, not my doubts, not my intentions. And yet I did not feel rejected. I felt understood. Many people live with the quiet fear that they are insignificant, that their struggles are unnoticed, that their prayers disappear into silence. What I experienced suggests the opposite. Nothing meaningful in a human life is overlooked. The second message concerns suffering. Why do good people suffer? Why do innocent families endure violence, poverty, illness, loss? These questions are as old as humanity itself, and I do not claim to possess simple answers. Yet from what I saw, suffering is not evidence of abandonment. I saw courage in places of devastation. I saw kindness where resources were scarce. I saw faith expressed by people who had every reason to despair. Suffering had not erased their humanity. In many cases, it had revealed it more clearly. Pain is real, injustice is real, but neither has the final word. The third message is about repentance, a word that is often misunderstood or avoided because it sounds harsh or condemning. In truth, repentance is not humiliation. It is return. It is the decision to turn away from what destroys and toward what gives life. Human beings make mistakes. We harm one another intentionally or unintentionally. We pursue selfish goals at the expense of others. Yet the possibility of change always remains open. No one is permanently defined by their worst moment unless they refuse to move beyond it. The fourth message concerns prayer. Before my experience, prayer was something I practiced, sometimes with discipline, sometimes hurriedly, sometimes distracted by responsibilities. Afterward, prayer became less like a ritual and more like communication, not reciting words into emptiness, but speaking to a presence that listens. Prayer does not always change circumstances immediately. Wars do not end overnight because someone prayed. Illness does not vanish on command, but prayer changes orientation. It aligns the human heart with something greater than fear or anger. And sometimes, alignment itself is the beginning of transformation. The fifth message addresses fear of death. Many people avoid thinking about death, treating it as a distant problem or an uncomfortable topic, yet ignoring death does not eliminate it. My experience removed much of that fear, not because death ceased to matter, but because I glimpsed what lies beyond it. I did not encounter chaos or oblivion, I encountered order, presence, meaning. That does not make death desirable. Life remains precious, and suffering remains painful, but it removes the sense of utter finality that often accompanies the thought of dying. Death, I came to believe, is not an annihilation but a transition. The sixth message is about love. Not romantic love or sentimentality, but the fundamental force that holds human communities together. Compassion, forgiveness, patience, generosity. In the presence I experienced, love was not weak or indulgent. It was powerful, steady, unshakable. Hatred divides. Violence destroys. Indifference corrodes slowly but thoroughly. Only love builds something that endures beyond immediate circumstances. For believers, this truth echoes the teachings they already know. For those uncertain about faith, it offers a practical guideline. Actions motivated by compassion create life, while actions motivated by cruelty create suffering. The seventh message concerns responsibility. Faith is not merely comfort, it is also calling. To believe in God is not only to seek protection or blessing, but to participate in the work of justice, mercy, and reconciliation in the world. A person who prays for peace but spreads division contradicts that prayer. A person who asks for forgiveness but refuses to forgive others blocks their own path to healing. Faith without action becomes hollow. Each individual, regardless of position, has the capacity to influence the world immediately around them. Family, neighbors, colleagues, strangers, encountered in daily life. Large-scale change begins with small acts repeated consistently. Finally, there is a message about hope for humanity as a whole. Our world often appears fragmented, driven by competition, suspicion, and conflict. Nations clash, communities divide, information spreads faster than understanding. It can feel as though darkness is gaining ground. Yet I saw something different. I saw that beneath the surface of chaos, countless people continue to choose goodness, caring for children, tending the sick, teaching the young, feeding the hungry, comforting the grieving. These acts rarely make headlines, but they sustain civilization more effectively than any policy. Humanity is not defined solely by its worst behavior. It is also defined by quiet faithfulness. To Christians in particular, I would say this: the teachings you hold are not relics of the past. They are instructions for survival in a world that often forgets its own humanity. Loving your neighbor, caring for the vulnerable, seeking justice, walking humbly, these are not optional ideals, they are necessities. And to those who do not identify with any specific faith, I would still say, live as though your actions matter beyond immediate reward. Choose compassion over cruelty. Choose truth over convenience. Choose reconciliation over resentment. Because whether one speaks in religious language or not, the principles that sustain human dignity are universal. I do not claim to have all answers. I do not claim to be a prophet. I am simply a man who was allowed to see briefly what lies beyond the limits of ordinary perception and who returned convinced that how we live now matters more than we realize. Since that night, many people have asked me what changed most, my body, my mind, or my faith. The truth is that all three were touched, but not in the way one might expect. I did not return with superhuman strength. I did not return with certainty about every political decision or every future event. I returned with something quieter, yet far more enduring. I returned with clarity about what truly matters. Standing between life and death stripped away illusions that had accumulated over years of struggle. It revealed how fragile we are, how dependent we are on one another, and how easily pride can convince us that we control more than we actually do. Above all, it revealed that humanity's greatest battles are not fought only with weapons or policies, but within the human heart. My hope for the world is not based on the absence of conflict. Conflict has existed since the beginning of history and will likely continue in some form as long as human beings live together. My hope rests instead on the possibility of transformation, that individuals, communities, and nations can choose a path that values life over destruction, dignity over domination, compassion over indifference. Africa, the continent I call home, has endured centuries of exploitation, division, and misunderstanding. Yet it is also a continent of extraordinary resilience, creativity, and faith. I believe deeply that Africa's future will not be defined solely by its hardships, but by the strength of its people and their determination to build something better for their children. Burkina Faso, small in geography but vast in spirit, represents that resilience. Our land may be dry, our resources limited in some respects, our challenges severe, but our people possess a courage that cannot be measured in economic statistics or military assessments. Farmers who cultivate soil under uncertain skies, teachers who continue lessons even when schools are damaged or under threat, parents who protect their children with everything they have, even when they themselves have nothing. These quiet acts of perseverance form the foundation of a nation more securely than any speech or treaty. To the people of Africa, I say this: do not allow anyone to convince you that your future is predetermined by your past. History influences us, but it does not imprison us unless we surrender to it. The destiny of a continent is shaped not only by external forces, but by the choices of those who live upon it, choices about governance, integrity, unity, and responsibility. To the wider world, I offer a different appeal. Do not see Africa only through the lens of crisis or opportunity. See it as a home to human beings whose aspirations are no different from your own. Safety for their families, meaningful work, education for their children, dignity in their daily lives. International relationships should be built not merely on strategic interest, but on mutual respect. No nation thrives in isolation, yet no nation should be required to surrender its soul in exchange for partnership. For those who hold positions of leadership anywhere in the world, whether over countries, communities, or organizations, I would share this simple truth: authority is not ownership, it is stewardship. You are entrusted with influence for a time, not granted permanent control. Use it to build, not merely to maintain power. Use it to serve, not merely to command. For ordinary citizens, though, there is truly nothing ordinary about any human life. I would say this: never underestimate the impact of your daily choices. You may feel powerless in the face of global events, but societies are shaped by countless individual actions repeated over time. Honesty, kindness, patience, responsibility, these are not small virtues. They are the threads from which stable communities are woven. If you are a person of faith, nurture that faith not only in private but in action. Care for those who cannot repay you. Speak truth even when it is inconvenient. Forgive where resentment would be easier. Faith that remains confined to words cannot heal a broken world. If you struggle with belief, do not assume that doubt disqualifies you from seeking meaning. Many of history's greatest transformations began with questions rather than certainties. Continue searching for truth, for goodness, for purpose. A sincere search already moves you closer to light. I also speak to those who feel overwhelmed by despair, whether due to personal loss, national turmoil, or the relentless stream of negative news that fills modern life. Darkness can appear dominant because it is loud, dramatic, and immediate. Light often works quietly, patiently, without drawing attention to itself. Yet even a small light changes the nature of darkness. You do not need to solve every problem. You do not need to carry the entire world on your shoulders. Begin where you are. Help one person. Repair one relationship. Improve one corner of your community. These actions ripple outward in ways you may never fully see. During the hours when my body lay near death, I experienced a peace beyond anything this world can provide. That peace did not come from wealth, status, or achievement. It came from presence, from being known and accepted by something greater than human judgment. I cannot give that peace to anyone else, but I can testify that it exists. And because it exists, despair is never the only option. If humanity is to move toward a better future, it will not happen through technology alone, or economic growth alone, or military strength alone. Those tools can support progress, but they cannot define its direction. Direction comes from values, from the collective decision that human life is sacred, that justice matters, that compassion is not weakness. The path forward will not be perfect. Mistakes will be made, conflicts will arise, but progress does not require perfection. It requires perseverance, guided by conscience. As for me, I continue to serve not because I believe myself indispensable, but because I believe service itself is the purpose of leadership. One day another will take my place, as happens in every generation. What matters is not the permanence of any individual, but the continuity of commitment to the common good. If the story of my survival carries any meaning, let it be this. Life is a gift, not a guarantee. Use it well. Use it to build rather than destroy. Use it to reconcile rather than divide. Use it to protect rather than exploit. And when your own time comes to leave this world, may you do so knowing that your presence made it better, not worse. I speak these words not as a legend, not as a symbol, but as a man who has seen how thin the line is between existence and absence. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have shared with you is the truth as I lived it. I am Ibrahim Traore, entrusted for a season with the care of a nation, and these words come from a heart that has stood at the edge of eternity. I am Ibrahim Traore, a servant before I am a leader, and I bear witness that life, faith, and hope are stronger than fear. If this testimony has stirred something within you, do not let that feeling fade without reflection. Speak about it with those you trust. Seek what is good. Support what brings life rather than harm. And if you wish to continue hearing stories that remind us of our shared humanity, remain close to those voices that encourage wisdom, compassion, and faith. May peace come to the world. May strength come to Africa. May light reach every soul willing to receive it. And may we all remember that even in the darkest hour, dawn is already on